The moment I heard her say those words in a crowded diner, I knew someone had to speak up, but I never expected it would change both our lives forever. What happens when a single act of humiliation exposes the worst in humanity and the best in one quiet stranger? This is the story of Lena Brooks, a waitress who made one devastating mistake in front of dozens of witnesses, and Ethan Walker, the man who refused to let cruelty win. Stay until the end to see how one voice in a silent room sparked a revolution. Hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The Franklin Street Diner had seen better days. Situated on the corner of a neighborhood that couldn't decide if it was climbing toward gentrification or sliding back into decay, the diner existed in that peculiar American purgatory, too worn to be charming, too functional to be abandoned. The vinyl booths had been patched so many times they resembled patchwork quilts. The chrome along the counter had dulled to a murky gray. Even the neon sign outside buzzed with a stutter, blinking "Für Enklinster et Dinar" to anyone who bothered to look up. But nobody really looked anymore. It was 8:47 on a Thursday morning, and the place hummed with its usual symphony of mediocrity. Coffee machines hissed, plates clattered against laminate tables. Conversations overlapped in a way that created noise without meaning. The acoustic wallpaper of working-class America grabbing breakfast before the grind began. At the counter, Marcus Webb sat hunched over scrambled eggs that had gone cold 10 minutes ago, scrolling through his phone with the mechanical rhythm of someone killing time rather than spending it. In booth 3, two construction workers argued about last night's game with the passion of men who had nothing else to care about. Near the window, an elderly woman named Dorothy picked at her oatmeal, her hands shaking just enough to make each spoonful an adventure. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, hung the smell of burnt coffee and fryer grease, that particular perfume of diners that have given up trying to be anything other than what they are. Lena Brooks moved through this landscape like a ghost, trying to convince herself she was still alive. 23 years old with dark circles under darker eyes, Lena had been waitressing at Franklin Street for 11 months, long enough to know every regular's order, short enough to still feel the sting of disappointment every time she walked through the door. Her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started tight at 6 a.m. and now sagged with exhaustion, caught the fluorescent light in a way that might have been pretty if anyone had bothered to notice. But nobody noticed Lena. She was part of the furniture, part of the routine. The girl who brought coffee and took orders and disappeared into the background of other people's mornings. Except today, something was different. Lena's legs burned with every step. It had seemed like a good idea last night, joining that new gym down on Porter Avenue, the one advertising transformation in 30 days on a banner that flapped in the wind like a desperate promise. She'd signed up 3 weeks ago during a moment of optimism that now felt foolish, paid the membership fee with money she should have saved, and told herself this would be the change she needed. Last night had been leg day. The trainer, a 20-year-old named Brad who had the enthusiasm of someone who'd never known real struggle, had pushed her through squats, lunges, leg presses, and something called Bulgarian split squats that Lena was fairly certain violated the Geneva Convention. She'd felt powerful in the moment, felt like maybe she was becoming someone different, someone stronger. Now, 12 hours later, her quadriceps felt like they'd been filled with concrete and set on fire. Every step was agony. Her inner thighs screamed with delayed onset muscle soreness, so severe that walking normally had become impossible. She'd tried to hide it when her shift started, tried to maintain that smooth professional glide that good waitresses master. But 3 hours in, the mask was cracking. She couldn't close her legs without pain shooting through her muscles like electrical current. So she'd adjusted, widened her stance, moved with her legs slightly apart in a way that reduced the screaming in her muscles to a manageable roar. She didn't think anyone would notice. She was wrong. "Refill?" Lena asked, approaching booth 7 with a pot of coffee that felt heavier than it should. The businessman sitting there, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch, wedding ring that probably cost more than Lena made in 3 months, glanced up from his laptop. His eyes traveled down, then back up, and something flickered across his face. Amusement? Judgment? Lena couldn't tell, but her stomach tightened anyway. "Sure," he said, pushing his cup forward. His voice carried that particular flatness of someone talking to service staff, present but not really there. Lena poured, trying to ignore the way her legs trembled slightly. Just get through the shift. 6 more hours. You can do this. She turned toward table 4, where a young couple sat in the comfortable silence of people who'd been together long enough to stop performing. They needed... Her foot caught. It shouldn't have. The floor was clear, but her legs, screaming their protest, didn't quite lift the way they should have. Her toe snagged on nothing, on air, on her own exhaustion. The coffee pot lurched. Lena's hand shot out, catching herself on the edge of table 5, but the damage was done. A spoon, just a single stupid spoon sitting on the table's edge, launched into the air with the grace of an Olympic diver and clattered to the floor with a sound that cut through the diner's ambient noise like a gunshot. The conversations didn't stop. Not immediately. But they stuttered. Paused. Heads turned with that predatory curiosity people have when someone else's misfortune briefly becomes entertainment. Lena straightened, her face already flushing. Sorry, I'm so... And then, because the universe has a cruel sense of timing, her legs locked up. The muscle spasm was instant and absolute. Her inner thighs, pushed beyond their limit, simply refused to move the way she needed them to. Lena stood frozen, legs slightly apart, unable to bring them together without pain so severe her vision briefly whited out. She tried. God, she tried. But her body wouldn't cooperate. I can't. The words came out before she could stop them, raw and unfiltered, carried by pain and frustration, and 11 months of swallowing every complaint, every hurt, every moment of indignity that came with being invisible. I can't close my legs. It hurts. Silence fell like a guillotine. For exactly 2 seconds, the Franklin Street diner went completely, utterly still. Then someone laughed. It started with Marcus at the counter, a snort he didn't quite manage to suppress, coffee halfway to his lips. The sound broke whatever spell had held the room, and suddenly laughter rippled outward like contamination spreading through water. The construction workers in booth 3 grinned at each other. One of them, a thick-necked man named Jake, whose morning routine Lena knew by heart, 2 eggs over easy, bacon crispy, wheat toast, orange juice, made a comment to his companion that Lena couldn't quite hear, but that made them both laugh harder. At table 6, a middle-aged woman in a nurse's scrubs whispered to her friend, hand covering her mouth but eyes bright with gossip. The friend's eyebrows shot up, and they both turned to stare at Lena with the kind of fascinated disgust usually reserved for car accidents. Even Dorothy, sweet Dorothy, who always left a $5 tip on a $7 breakfast, pressed her lips together in a thin line of disapproval. Lena felt the room close in on her. This wasn't laughter that included her. This was laughter that fed on her. Each chuckle, each whisper, each knowing glance carried the same message. We know what you were doing last night. We know what kind of girl you are. Her throat closed. Heat flooded her face, her neck, her chest. The kind of full-body flush that comes with shame so complete it becomes physical. The coffee pot in her hand trembled. Lena, the voice came from behind the counter. Sharp. Impatient. Male. Rick Morrison, the day manager, stood with his arms crossed over a stained white shirt that had long ago given up the fight against sweat stains and coffee spills. He was 52 years old and had been managing the Franklin Street diner for 23 years, a fact he mentioned to every new employee as though length of service somehow equaled competence. His face, perpetually red from blood pressure that his doctor kept warning him about, had gone a shade darker. What the hell is going on out here? Rick's voice carried over the dying laughter, which tapered off into giggles and whispers. You're making a scene. I'm sorry, the spoon fell, and my legs... I don't need your life story. Rick waved his hand dismissively, already turning back toward the kitchen. Just clean it up and keep moving. We've got customers waiting. Lena bent down to retrieve the spoon, and her legs screamed their protest. She had to brace herself against the table, had to move slowly, carefully, while dozens of eyes watched her struggle. When she stood, spoon in hand, the businessman in booth 7 was staring at his laptop screen with theatrical intensity. The couple at table 4 studied their menus as though the secrets of the universe were hidden in the breakfast specials. Even Marcus had found something fascinating on his phone. Nobody would meet her eyes. But the whispers continued. Softer now, more insidious.
Did you see? Can't even walk straight. Must have had quite a night. Lena's hands shook as she deposited the spoon in the bus tray. She could feel their judgment like weight on her skin, suffocating and inescapable. Every step back toward the counter felt like walking through mud. The rest of the room had returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed. Coffee was sipped. Orders were placed. The moment passed for everyone except Lena, who felt like she was drowning in open air. She didn't notice the man in the window booth. Ethan Walker had been coming to the Franklin Street Diner every weekday morning for 6 months. His routine was religious in its consistency. Drop 7-year-old Sophie at Riverside Elementary at 8:15, drive to Franklin Street by 8:30, order the same breakfast, 2 scrambled eggs, hash browns, wheat toast, coffee black, and sit in the same booth by the window.
Read the news on his phone until 9:15, then drive to whatever construction site needed his hands that day. The diner was his pause button. The 30 minutes between being dad and being labor. The brief window where he could exist without someone needing something from him. At 34, Ethan looked older. The kind of aging that comes from responsibility rather than years. His face, handsome in a rough-hewn way, carried lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, were calloused and scarred. The hands of someone who'd built things and broken things and fixed things until the distinction blurred. He wore what he always wore. Jeans that had seen better days, a flannel shirt over a faded t-shirt, work boots that were more functional than fashionable. His dark hair, starting to show gray at the temples, needed a cut he kept putting off. Ethan didn't look like a hero. He looked like every other working-class father in America. Tired, persistent, doing his best with what he had. But something was different this morning. He'd noticed Lena the first time he came to Franklin Street. Not in any romantic way. Ethan's capacity for romance had died with his wife 3 years ago. But in the way you notice someone who's trying very hard to be invisible. He recognized the posture, the careful smile that never quite reached the eyes, the way she moved through the world like she was apologizing for taking up space. He'd watched her serve him breakfast for 6 months without ever exchanging more than pleasantries. But he'd noticed. And this morning, he'd noticed her pain, the stiffness in her walk, the way she braced herself when she thought nobody was looking, the microsecond of wincing before her professional mask slid back into place. Ethan knew that dance. He'd performed it himself countless times, showing up to work with a pulled muscle, a twisted ankle, a back that screamed with every movement, because calling in sick meant losing pay, and losing pay meant Sophie eating cereal for dinner instead of actual food. You worked through pain because you didn't have a choice, because toughness wasn't optional when someone depended on you. So when Lena's voice cracked across the diner, "I can't close my legs, it hurts," Ethan didn't laugh. He watched the room turn predatory, watched decent people transform into a mob, united by their assumption, their judgment, their cruel certainty that they knew exactly what kind of girl would make such a statement. He watched Lena's face crumble, watched her try to hold herself together while everything inside her shattered, and something in Ethan's chest tightened like a fist. He thought about Sophie, about the world she was growing up in, about the lessons she'd learned from moments like this, that cruelty was acceptable if enough people participated, that judgment was easier than compassion, that silence in the face of wrong was the same as endorsement. He thought about Sarah, his wife, who died of an aneurysm while folding laundry on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving him alone with a 4-year-old and no idea how to be both parents at once. Sarah, who'd always been the first to defend someone, the first to speak up when something wasn't right. What would she do? The answer came immediately. Sarah would never let this stand. Ethan's breakfast sat half-eaten in front of him. His coffee had gone lukewarm. Outside the window, the morning traffic crawled past. People going to jobs they hated, living lives they'd settled for, accepting mediocrity because change required courage they didn't have. Inside the diner, Lena moved like a wounded animal, trying to finish her shift, while the room that had just mocked her returned to its comfortable routine. Ethan's jaw clenched. He couldn't fix the world, couldn't solve Lena's problems or erase what had just happened. But he could do something. He could refuse to let cruelty be the final word. He'd been sitting in silence his whole life, through school, through jobs, through 1,000 small injustices that seemed too insignificant to fight. He'd convinced himself that quiet endurance was a virtue, that minding your own business was wisdom. But watching Lena's humiliation, seeing her reduced to entertainment for strangers who knew nothing about her life, Ethan realized something. Silence wasn't neutral, it was complicity, and he was tired of being complicit. Ethan pulled out his wallet, counted out bills, and left them on the table, enough for his breakfast and a tip that was probably excessive but felt necessary. He didn't think about what he was doing, didn't plan his words, didn't rehearse his speech. He just stood up. The movement was quiet, unremarkable. But something in the quality of it, the deliberateness, the steadiness, caught the attention of the businessman in booth 7, who glanced up from his laptop with vague curiosity. Ethan didn't look at him. Didn't look at anyone yet. He simply stood there, this ordinary man in an ordinary diner, and took a breath that felt like the first real breath he'd taken in years. Lena was behind the counter now, pouring coffee with mechanical precision. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her face had gone blank. She'd retreated into that protective numbness that gets you through the rest of your shift, the rest of your day, the rest of your life. Ethan recognized that numbness too. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but it carried. The voice of someone who'd spent years on construction sites learning to project without shouting. A few heads turned, not many. Most people were too absorbed in their own breakfast, their own phones, their own carefully curated ignorance of anything that didn't directly concern them. Ethan tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me." This time, the diner fell quiet. Not the stunned silence from before. This was different, curious, uncertain. The silence of people who've realized something is happening but aren't yet sure if it concerns them. Ethan felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of their attention. Every instinct screamed at him to sit down, shut up, mind his own business. Instead, he spoke. "I need to say something," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "About what just happened." The construction workers in booth 3 exchanged glances. The nurse and her friend stopped mid-whisper. Even Rick, halfway through the kitchen door, paused and turned around. Lena looked up from the coffee pot, her eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been fear. "That young woman," Ethan continued, gesturing toward Lena without looking away from the room. "The one you all just laughed at? She's in pain. Physical pain. From working out. From trying to improve herself. From doing something hard because she thought it would make her stronger." He could see comprehension dawning on some faces, denial hardening on others. "But none of you asked," Ethan said, and now there was an edge to his voice. Not anger exactly, but something close. Disappointment. "None of you thought, maybe there's another explanation. You just assumed. You laughed. You judged. You made her into a joke because it was easier than showing basic human decency." Marcus at the counter set down his coffee cup with a soft clink that seemed loud in the silence. "I've worked construction for 12 years, Ethan continued. I've shown up to job sites with pulled muscles, torn ligaments, backs that screamed every time I bent over. You know what I got? Sympathy. Tough break, man. Take it easy today. Let someone else handle the heavy stuff." He looked around the room, meeting eyes that tried to look away. "She said the exact same thing I've said 100 times. It hurts. I can't move right. And you turned it into something dirty, something shameful. You sexualized her pain because it was a woman saying it, and that says a lot more about all of you than it does about her." The businessman in booth 7 had closed his laptop. The construction workers stared at their plates. Dorothy's oatmeal sat forgotten, her trembling hands now clasped in her lap. "So here's what's going to happen," Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You're all going to think about what you just did. About how quick you were to mock someone who didn't deserve it, about how easy it is to be cruel when everyone else is doing it." He finally turned to look at Lena, who stood frozen behind the counter, tears streaming down her face. "And maybe," Ethan said softly, speaking to the room but looking at her, "maybe you'll think twice next time before you decide someone's suffering is entertainment." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock or the silence of complicity. This was the silence of shame, thick and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Ethan walked toward the door, each step measured and calm. As he passed the counter, he paused just long enough to catch Lena's eye. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly, meant only for her. "Remember that." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft chime that seemed absurdly cheerful given the moment. The diner stayed silent for exactly 10 seconds. Then slowly, like ice beginning to thaw, movement returned. The businessman opened his laptop, then closed it again. The construction workers studied their coffee cups. The nurse and her friend didn't resume their conversation. Rick cleared his throat awkwardly and disappeared into the kitchen. And Lena stood behind the counter, coffee pot still in hand, and tried to remember how to breathe. Someone had seen her. After 11 months of being invisible, of being background noise, of being whatever customers needed her to be, someone had actually seen her. Not as a waitress, not as a joke, not as entertainment or inconvenience or service industry automaton, as a person, a human being worthy of defense. Her legs still hurt. The room was still full of people who'd laughed at her pain. Nothing about her situation had materially changed, but everything felt different. Because for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lena didn't feel quite so alone. The chime of the door still echoed in Lena's ears when the first customer stood to leave. It was the businessman from booth 7, the one with the expensive watch and wedding ring that caught the light every time he typed. He closed his laptop with deliberate care, sliding it into a leather messenger bag that probably cost more than Lena's monthly rent. When he approached the counter to pay, he wouldn't look at her. $18.75, Lena said quietly, her voice still shaky from crying. He handed her a $50 bill. "Keep the change." Lena blinked. "Sir, that's over $30. "I know what it is." His voice was clipped, professional, the same tone he'd probably use in boardrooms and conference calls. But his ears had gone red, creeping up from his collar like a visible manifestation of shame. "Keep it." So he was gone before Lena could respond, the door chiming again as he escaped into the morning that had suddenly become easier to face than the interior of Franklin Street Diner. Lena stared at the 50 in her hand, still warm from his wallet, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Behind her, Rick emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of hash browns that had been sitting under the heat lamp too long. He set it down with more force than necessary, the plates rattling against each other. "What the hell was that about?" he demanded, though his usual bluster seemed muted, like he was reading lines he no longer believed in. "I don't know." Lena's fingers closed around the 50. Not the customer. That guy. The one who made a whole goddamn speech in the middle of my restaurant. Rick's face had returned to its normal shade of red, but something in his eyes had shifted. "You know him?" "No?" Lena realized it was true. She'd seen the man before. Seen him every weekday morning for months, actually, but she didn't know his name, his story, anything beyond his breakfast order, and the fact that he always sat in the window booth and read his phone with the focused intensity of someone trying very hard not to think about something else. "Well, he knows you." Rick grabbed the coffee pot from her hands with more gentleness than she'd expected. "Take your break. 15 minutes. Go sit down." Lena stared at him. In 11 months, Rick had never offered her an unscheduled break, had never shown her anything resembling kindness beyond the bare minimum required to keep her showing up for shifts. "Rick, I'm fine. I can—" It wasn't a request, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "Go, sit. I'll cover the floor." Lena walked to the back booth on legs that still screamed with every step, but the pain felt distant now, muffled by the surreal quality that had settled over the morning. She slid into the cracked vinyl seat and pressed her palms flat against the cool laminate table, trying to ground herself in something solid. The diner had resumed its normal operations, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations continued in lower voices, as though volume might draw attention to the participants. The construction workers ate their breakfast in silence, occasionally glancing toward the door the stranger had exited through. Even the ambient noise felt subdued, plates set down more carefully, utensils handled with deliberate quiet. Shame, Lena realized, had a sound. It was the sound of people trying very hard to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. At table 4, the young couple who'd witnessed her humiliation were having a whispered argument. Lena couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. The woman gesturing sharply, the man's defensive posture, the push and pull of two people discovering they disagreed about something fundamental. Dorothy, the elderly woman with the shaking hands, stood slowly and made her way to the counter. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones had begun to betray her, each step a negotiation with gravity and time. When she reached the register, she pulled out her worn leather wallet and counted out bills with trembling fingers. "Could you—" Dorothy's voice was soft, apologetic. "Could you give this to the young lady, the waitress?" Rick glanced at the money. $20 for a $7 breakfast. "You want me to give her a $13 tip?" "I want you to give her an apology I don't have the courage to say in person." Dorothy's eyes, watery and blue behind thick glasses, met his. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I should have known better." She left before Rick could respond, moving through the door with the slow dignity of someone carrying regret like extra weight. Rick looked down at the 20 in his hand, then over at Lena in the back booth. Something in his expression shifted, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of it. He walked over and set the money on the table in front of her. "From Dorothy," he said gruffly. "She says she's sorry." Lena stared at the bill. First $50 from the businessman, now 20 from Dorothy. She'd made more in tips in the last 10 minutes than she usually made in an entire shift, and each dollar felt like penance. Other people's guilt converted to currency. "Rick," she said quietly, "what did I do?" "You didn't do anything." He said it with the firmness of someone trying to convince himself as much as her. "That's the problem. You didn't do a damn thing wrong, and we all—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Finish your break. Take 20 minutes if you need it." He walked away before she could thank him, disappearing into the kitchen where the sounds of cooking provided cover for whatever he was feeling. Lena sat alone in the booth and watched the diner transform around her. The nurse and her friend paid their bill and left a tip that was 3 times their meal cost. They didn't say anything to Lena, couldn't meet her eyes, but the money spoke for them. Marcus at the counter finished his cold eggs and approached the register. When Rick rang him up, Marcus pulled out his wallet and hesitated. "Is she okay?" he asked, voice low. "The girl?" "Her name's Lena," Rick said flatly, "and you could ask her yourself." Marcus's face flushed. He set down a 10 for a $6 breakfast and fled without waiting for change. One by one, they left. One by one, they paid their penance in bills and coins and couldn't quite apologize glances. The diner emptied faster than usual for a Thursday morning, as though the building itself had become uncomfortable, a place where people had revealed something ugly about themselves and wanted desperately to forget. By 9:30, only 3 customers remained. The construction workers in booth 3 sat in stubborn silence, as though leaving would constitute an admission of wrongdoing they weren't ready to make. Their food had gone cold, their coffee cups sat empty, but they didn't move. Lena watched them from her booth, studying the set of their shoulders, the careful way they avoided looking in her direction. The one who'd made the joke, Jake, with his thick neck and thinning hair, kept running his hand over his face like he could physically wipe away whatever he was feeling. Finally, his companion, a younger guy Lena had heard called Tommy, spoke. "We should go." "We're not done eating," Jake said, though his plate had been empty for 20 minutes. "Yeah, we are." Tommy stood, pulled out his wallet, and threw down a 20. "Come on." Jake didn't move. "I'm not apologizing for a joke." "Nobody asked you to." Tommy's voice was quiet but firm. "But that guy was right. We were assholes. We assumed. We laughed at someone who was hurting. And maybe—" He paused, seemed to gather something. "Maybe we should think about why that was our first instinct. Jesus Christ, when did you become so sensitive?" "When I realized my daughter's going to grow up in a world full of guys like us." Tommy was already walking toward the door. "You coming or not?" Jake sat alone for another 30 seconds, his face cycling through emotions. Anger, defensiveness, something that might have been understanding, back to anger. Then he stood, threw down another $10, and followed Tommy out without looking back. The door chimed. The diner fell into a silence that felt cleaner than before. Rick emerged from the kitchen and surveyed the empty room. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that's going to hurt the lunch rush." Lena finally stood, her legs protesting but manageable now that the initial shock of the muscle soreness had faded into a persistent ache. She walked to the counter and began collecting the money that had accumulated. Bills left on tables, stuffed into the check holders, placed directly on the counter with the weight of unspoken apologies. $147 in tips from a morning that usually brought in 30 if she was lucky. The math of shame, Lena thought, was apparently quite generous. "You should go home," Rick said, startling her. He was wiping down the counter with mechanical precision, not looking at her. "Take the day. I'll cover your shift." "Rick, you can't work the floor and manage—" "I managed this place solo for 3 years before I hired help." He wrung out the rag with more force than necessary. "I think I can handle a slow Thursday." Lena hesitated, the money still clutched in her hand. "Did I cost you business? Is that why you want me gone?" Rick stopped wiping, set down the rag, turned to face her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, something almost approaching remorse. 23 years I've run this place," he said quietly. 23 years of breakfast rushes and lunch crowds and learning every regular's order before they sit down. You know what I learned in all that time?" Lena shook her head. "People are predictable. They want their coffee hot, their eggs cooked right, and someone to smile at them while they pretend their lives aren't falling apart." He picked up the rag again, folded it with careful precision. "What I forgot is that the person doing the smiling might have a life that's falling apart too." He finally looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she'd started working there. "I should have said something," Rick continued. "When they laughed, when they assumed. I'm the manager. It's my job to protect my staff, and I—" He stopped, jaw working like the words were physically difficult to produce. "I didn't. I told you to clean it up and keep moving, like you were the problem." Lena felt tears threaten again, but these were different from before. Less about humiliation and more about the strange, overwhelming experience of being seen by someone who'd looked through her for 11 months. "You didn't know," she said softly. "I should have asked." Rick turned away, began wiping down a counter that was already clean. "That guy, the one who spoke up, he didn't know you either, but he asked the right questions. He assumed the best instead of the worst. And I've been in this business long enough that I should have known better." Lena stood there, not sure what to say, not sure if there was anything to say. The moment stretched between them, awkward and sincere and fragile. "Go home, Lena," Rick finally said, his voice back to its usual gruffness but lacking its edge. "Rest your legs. Come back tomorrow and we'll pretend this never happened. Or we'll talk about it, whatever you need." Lena gathered her things from the back, her jacket, her phone, her dignity that felt slightly less shattered than it had an hour ago. As she walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at the diner that had been her prison and her paycheck for almost a year. Rick was still wiping the counter. The tables sat empty. The coffee machine hissed softly to itself. Morning light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to everything that had transpired. "Rick?" Lena said. He looked up. "Thank you." He nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin that conveyed more than words could. Then he turned back to his work, and Lena walked out into a world that felt different than the one she'd entered at 6 that morning. The parking lot of Franklin Street Diner was mostly empty now, just Rick's beat-up Civic and Lena's ancient Honda with the passenger door that didn't quite close right. The morning had warmed into the kind of day that couldn't decide if it wanted to be spring or still pretend it winter. The sun bright, but the air carrying a chill that made Lena pull her jacket tighter. She should go home, should take Rick's advice and rest, let her body recover, try to process what had happened. Instead, she found herself standing next to her car, keys in hand, staring at nothing. A man had defended her. A complete stranger had stood up in a room full of people and called them out for their cruelty, had seen her pain and believed it rather than mocking it, had given her back her dignity when she'd thought it was irretrievably lost, and she didn't even know his name. Lena pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trying to capture the feeling of the moment before it faded into just another story she'd tell herself about the time something good happened. But how do you write about being saved? How do you explain the sensation of drowning in public only to have a stranger throw you a lifeline? How do you put into words the realization that kindness still exists, that not everyone assumes the worst, that sometimes people speak up even when silence would be easier. She couldn't. So instead she wrote, "Window booth guy, black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast. Every weekday at 8:30, find out his name." It wasn't enough. It didn't capture anything close to what she was feeling, but it was something to hold on to, a thread she could follow when the memory of this morning started to feel like something she'd imagined. Lena was about to get in her car when she heard the rumble of an engine. She looked up to see a pickup truck, forest green, at least 15 years old, with a toolbox in the bed and a child's car seat visible through the back window, pulling into the parking lot. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. The truck parked 2 spaces down from her Honda. The engine cut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened and Ethan Walker stepped out. He looked exactly as he had inside the diner, jeans, flannel, work boots, tired eyes that had seen too much and decided to care anyway. But out here, in the morning light, Lena could see details she'd missed before. The scar on his left hand, pale and jagged like he'd cut himself on something sharp and never quite healed right. The way he moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to conserve energy because the day was long and rest was a luxury. The set of his shoulders that suggested he was carrying weight that wasn't visible. He saw her and stopped, one hand still on the truck door. For a moment, they just looked at each other, 2 people who'd shared something intimate without ever having a real conversation. "I forgot my—" Ethan gestured vaguely toward the diner, then seemed to realize the excuse was transparent. "Actually, no. I didn't forget anything. I came back to check if you were okay." Lena's throat tightened. "You came back for me?" "I came back to make sure they didn't make it worse after I left." He closed the truck door, leaned against it with a casualness that didn't quite hide his discomfort. Sometimes standing up for someone just makes people angrier, defensive. "I wanted to be sure you were safe." The word hung in the air between them. Safe. Such a simple concept, such an impossible thing to guarantee. "They left," Lena said quietly. "Most of them. The ones who stayed, they apologized with their tips. I made more money this morning than I usually make in 2 days." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Money's not an apology." "No," Lena agreed, "but it's something. It means they knew they were wrong, even if they couldn't say it out loud. They shouldn't have been wrong in the first place." The anger in his voice surprised them both. Ethan took a breath, seemed to physically push the emotion down. "Sorry, people should be better." "But they're not?" Lena took a step toward him, then another, until they were standing close enough to have a real conversation instead of shouting across a parking lot. "Most of the time, they're not better. They laugh. They judge. They assume the worst because it's easier than thinking. And we accept it. We learn to live with it. We shouldn't have to." "No," Lena said softly. "We shouldn't. But we do. Until someone like you decides that's not acceptable anymore." Ethan looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "I didn't do anything special. I just said what needed saying. You stood up." Lena heard the thickness in her own voice, felt the tears threatening again, and didn't care. "In a room full of people who were either laughing at me or pretending they didn't see what was happening, you stood up. You used your voice. You made them accountable. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" "It shouldn't be rare." Ethan's hands flexed at his sides, opening and closing like he was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. "Common decency shouldn't be remarkable." "But it is. It is remarkable. You are—" Lena stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of language. "How do you thank someone for giving you back your humanity?" "I don't even know your name." Ethan Walker." "Lena Brooks." She held out her hand, a formal gesture that felt absurd given what they'd already shared, but Ethan took it anyway. His handshake was firm, brief, the handshake of someone who'd been taught that a man's word and his grip said everything about his character. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the morning chill. When they separated, the air felt different, charged with something neither of them quite knew how to name. "I should let you get home," Ethan said, but he didn't move toward the diner, didn't move away from her. Just stood there, the stranger who'd somehow become something more in the span of a single conversation. "I should probably rest," Lena agreed, also not moving.
My legs are killing me. I did Bulgarian split squats last night, which I'm now convinced were invented by someone who hates humanity. A smile flickered across Ethan's face, brief but genuine, transforming his features from tired to almost handsome. Those are brutal. I did them once and couldn't walk right for a week. Just a week? It's been 12 hours and I feel like I've aged 40 years. It gets better. Day 3 is the worst, but after that, your muscles start to forgive you. Good to know I have 2 more days of agony to look forward to. Lena surprised herself by laughing, a real laugh, not the customer service approximation she'd perfected over 11 months of waitressing. At least now when I can't walk, people will know why. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. The reminder of what had happened, of the humiliation that had brought them to this parking lot conversation in the first place. But Ethan just nodded, his expression serious again. They know because I made sure they knew. And if anyone asks tomorrow, you tell them the truth. You were working out. You were trying to be stronger. There's nothing shameful about that. Even when it means I can't do my job properly? Especially then. Ethan's voice was firm, carrying the weight of lived experience. I've shown up to construction sites barely able to move. Know what I learned? The body heals. The work gets done. And the people who matter understand that pushing yourself is how you grow. Lena studied him, really looked at him for the first time, saw the man behind the defender, the person behind the speech, saw someone who understood pain and persistence and the daily choice to keep showing up even when everything hurt. You have a daughter, she said, remembering the car seat in his truck. I've seen you come in after school drop-off. Something in Ethan's face softened. Sophie, she's 7. Thinks she knows everything, which is terrifying because she usually does. And it's just the 2 of you? The question was forward, probably too personal for a parking lot conversation with someone she'd just formally met. But Lena had stopped caring about proper boundaries. This man had seen her at her worst. Politeness seemed irrelevant. 3 years now, Ethan said quietly. My wife, Sarah, she had an aneurysm. 1 minute she was folding laundry, the next she was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. God, I'm so sorry. Don't be. He said it without bitterness, just fact. You didn't know. Most people don't. I don't talk about it much because talking doesn't change anything. Sarah's still dead. Sophie still has to grow up without her mom. I still have to figure out how to be 2 parents instead of 1. Lena felt something click into place, understanding sliding home like a key in a lock. That's why you said something, in the diner, because you're teaching your daughter how to be in the world. Ethan met her eyes, and she saw the truth there before he spoke it. I'm teaching her that silence is complicity, that watching someone suffer and doing nothing makes you part of the problem, that sometimes the right thing is also the hard thing, and you do it anyway because that's what decent people do. Does she know about this morning? No, and she won't. Ethan's expression turned rueful. She thinks her dad is boring and predictable and embarrassing, which is exactly what a 7-year-old should think. She doesn't need to know that sometimes boring, predictable dad makes speeches in diners. I think she'd be proud of you. I think she'd ask why I didn't video it for TikTok. But Ethan smiled when he said it, the smile of a father who loved his daughter's generation even when he didn't understand it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Cars passed on the street behind them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world continued its normal operations while they existed in this pocket of pause, this brief connection forged in crisis and extending into something neither had expected. I should really go, Lena finally said, though she made no move toward her car. Rick gave me the day off, which never happens, so I should probably take advantage before he changes his mind. And I should get to work before my boss fires me for being late. Ethan pushed off from his truck, standing straight for the first time since they'd started talking. But before I go, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a simple business card, white, minimalist, professional, in a way that seemed at odds with his flannel and jeans. I do carpentry, Ethan explained, handing her the card. Custom furniture, home repairs, that kind of thing. Side work on weekends when I'm not on a construction site. I'm not trying to sell you anything, he added quickly, seeing her expression.
If you ever need something fixed or built or just, I don't know, if you need to talk to someone who understands what it's like to work through pain and show up anyway, call me." Lena took the card, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. The card was thick, quality stock, embossed with simple lettering, Ethan Walker, custom carpentry, and a phone number below. "Thank you," she said, meaning for more than just the card. For the defense, for coming back, for seeing her as a person worthy of standing up for existing in a world that had seemed determined to grind her down until she disappeared. "You don't owe me thanks." Ethan was already backing toward the diner, putting distance between them before the moment could become too heavy. "You didn't do anything wrong. I just reminded people of that." He disappeared inside, presumably to retrieve whatever excuse he'd invented for coming back. Lena stood alone in the parking lot, business card in hand, feeling like she'd just lived through something significant but couldn't quite articulate what it was. She looked down at the card. Such a small thing, just paper and ink. But it represented possibility, connection that extended beyond a single moment, proof that kindness didn't have to be anonymous, evidence that the stranger who defended her was also just a person trying to make his way through the world with whatever tools he had. Lena got into her Honda, started the engine that took 3 tries before it caught, and sat there as it warmed up. Through the diner windows, she could see Ethan talking to Rick at the counter, both men's body language stiff with the awkwardness of people trying to have a conversation neither was quite equipped for. Then Ethan nodded, shook Rick's hand, another one of those firm, brief handshakes that said more than words, and walked back out. He didn't look at Lena's car as he got into his truck, didn't wave or acknowledge her presence, just climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot with the casual efficiency of someone who had places to be and people depending on him. But just before he turned onto the main road, his eyes flicked to his rearview mirror. And even though Lena couldn't see his face clearly from this distance, she imagined, maybe foolishly, maybe not, that he was checking to make sure she was still there. Still okay, still safe. She watched his truck disappear into traffic, then pulled out her phone and saved his number from the business card. Under the contact name, she hesitated, then typed, "Ethan Walker, the good one." It felt insufficient, reductive. How do you summarize someone in a contact name? But it was true. In a morning full of people who'd shown her the worst of humanity, Ethan Walker had reminded her that good people still existed, still spoke up, still cared enough to come back and check on a stranger they'd defended. Lena finally pulled out of the parking lot and drove home to the apartment she could barely afford, with legs that still ached and a heart that felt lighter than it had in months. And in her pocket, a business card that represented more than carpentry services. It represented the possibility that sometimes, when you least expect it, someone sees you, really sees you, and decides you're worth defending. Lena's apartment was a study in making do with less. The one-bedroom unit sat on the 3rd floor of a building that had been scheduled for renovation 5 years ago and still wore that promise like faded paint, peeling around the edges, cracking at the seams, but stubbornly standing. The carpet was beige in theory, but gray in practice, worn thin in pathways that mapped the previous tenant's life. The kitchen was barely large enough to qualify as such, with a stove that only 3 burners worked and a refrigerator that hummed so loudly Lena had learned to sleep through it. But it was hers. Or at least, it would be hers for another 18 days until rent was due again, and the math of her life would require creative solutions she hadn't figured out yet. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs protesting each step with the kind of pain that had moved beyond sharp and settled into a deep, persistent ache. By the time she reached her door, she was breathing hard and reconsidering every decision that had led to Bulgarian split squats. Inside, the apartment was exactly as she'd left it at 5:45 that morning. Coffee mug in the sink, bed unmade, yesterday's clothes draped over the chair that served as both seating and closet overflow. The normalcy of it felt jarring after the morning she'd had, like stepping from one reality into another. Lena dropped her keys on the counter, her jacket on the chair, herself onto the couch that sagged in the middle from years of supporting bodies that had nowhere better to sit. She pulled out Ethan's business card and studied it in the afternoon light filtering through blinds she kept meaning to replace. The card was simple, almost austere. No fancy logo, no embellishments, just his name, his trade, and a phone number. The kind of card a man would design who didn't believe in false advertising, who let his work speak louder than his marketing. Lena turned it over. The back was blank except for a small line at the bottom. Built to last. She wasn't sure if it was a slogan or a promise or just a statement of philosophy, but something about those 3 words made her throat tight. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rick. "Take tomorrow off too if you need it. We'll manage." She stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure she'd understood correctly. Rick Morrison, who'd never offered her a sick day or a kind word in 11 months, was giving her 2 days off. The world had tilted on its axis, and Lena wasn't sure which way was up anymore. She typed back, "Thank you. I'll be there Saturday morning." The response came immediately. "Make it Saturday afternoon. Give yourself time." Lena set down her phone and let herself cry. Not the humiliated tears from the diner or the overwhelming tears in the parking lot, but something quieter. Tears of release, maybe. Or recognition. The kind of crying that happens when you've been holding yourself together so tightly for so long that even small kindnesses feel like breaking. She cried until she was empty, until the tears stopped meaning anything and became just salt water and exhaustion. Then she dragged herself to the bathroom, ran a shower as hot as she could stand, and let the water work at the knots in her muscles while her mind tried to process everything that had happened. A stranger had defended her. Her manager had shown her kindness. Customers had apologized with money because they couldn't apologize with words. The universe had cracked open just enough to let light in, and Lena didn't know what to do with that except stand under scalding water and try to believe it was real. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that had seen better days, her phone was ringing. Unknown number. Lena almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were usually bill collectors or scammers, and she didn't have the energy for either, but something made her pick up. "Hello?" "Lena, it's Dorothy from the diner." The voice was elderly, wavering slightly, but determined. "I hope you don't mind. I got your number from Rick. I told him I wanted to apologize properly, and he said you deserved to hear it directly." Lena sat down hard on her bed. "Dorothy, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." The old woman's voice strengthened. "I sat there this morning and watched them laugh at you. Worse than that, I judged you. In my head, I thought terrible things about a young woman I don't even know. And when you needed someone to speak up, I stayed silent. You weren't the only one." "No, but I should have been better." Dorothy took a shaky breath. "I'm 83 years old, Lena. I've lived through wars and recessions and more change than I can count. I've seen people at their best and their worst. And I know that silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of cruelty." Lena pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back fresh tears. "That young man who stood up," Dorothy continued, "he reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that doing the right thing isn't about being comfortable. It's about being decent, and I failed that test this morning." "You left me a tip," Lena said softly. "You told Rick to apologize for you." "Money isn't an apology. That's what my husband used to say, God rest him. He'd say, 'Dorothy, if you hurt someone, you look them in the eye and you tell them you're sorry. You don't send flowers or checks or excuses. You show up." Her voice cracked. "So I'm showing up, even if it's just over the phone. I'm sorry, Lena. I'm so deeply sorry." "I forgive you." The words came out before Lena could think about them, automatic and true. "Dorothy, I forgive you." The old woman was crying now. Lena could hear it. "You're a good girl." "Better than I deserve?" "We all deserve forgiveness," Lena said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Wasn't sure she'd forgiven herself for all the times she'd stayed silent, all the moments she'd looked away rather than getting involved. We all do things we regret. They talked for another 10 minutes, Dorothy sharing stories about her late husband, about working as a nurse for 40 years, about the ways the world had changed and the ways it stubbornly stayed the same. By the time they hung up, Lena felt lighter, like some weight she didn't know she was carrying had been lifted. The rest of the day passed in a haze of rest and recovery. Lena took ibuprofen for her legs, made herself eat something that wasn't instant noodles, and tried to process the fundamental shift that had occurred in her understanding of the world. She'd spent so long believing that people were fundamentally selfish, that cruelty was the default setting, that hoping for better was naive. But this morning had shown her something different. Yes, people laughed. Yes, they judged. Yes, they assumed the worst, but they could also change, could recognize their mistakes, could reach out across the divide of their shame and try to make amends. It wasn't perfect redemption. Dorothy was just one person, and her phone call didn't erase the laughter of everyone else. But it was something, a data point against despair, proof that growth was possible even at 83. As evening fell, Lena found herself thinking about Ethan Walker, wondering what he was doing, whether he was home with his daughter, whether he'd thought about the diner incident at all, or if it had just been another Thursday for him. She pulled up his contact on her phone, stared at it for a long moment, then set the phone aside. What would she even say? Thank you again? The words felt inadequate, too small to carry the weight of what she was feeling. Instead, she went to bed early, her body crying out for rest, and dreamed of diners and strangers and the unexpected ways that lives intersect. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Walker was discovering that doing the right thing had consequences. The construction site where he worked, a half-finished office building in the business district that was already 6 months behind schedule, hummed with the usual chaos of men and machines trying to impose order on raw materials. Ethan had arrived at 10, an hour late, expecting to catch hell from his foreman. Instead, he'd walked into something worse than anger, curiosity. Walker! Big Mike, the foreman who'd gotten his nickname from being 6'5" and built like a refrigerator, waved him over. Where the hell you been? Had something I needed to take care of. Ethan grabbed his tool belt from the truck, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Something or someone? This from Danny Martinez, a framing carpenter who'd worked with Ethan for 3 years and thought that entitled him to commentary on Ethan's personal life. You got that look, man, the look of a guy who got distracted by a pretty face. I got stuck in traffic, Ethan lied, because the truth, I made a speech in a diner defending a waitress I don't know seemed likely to invite more questions than it answered, but Big Mike was studying him with the kind of attention that came from managing crews for 20 years and learning to read people better than blueprints. You all right? You seem different. I'm fine. Just late. Won't happen again. Ethan tried to escape into work, but the morning kept replaying in his head. Lena's face when the room had laughed at her. The silence that fell when he stood up. The weight of all those eyes on him, judging, measuring, deciding whether to listen or dismiss. He'd meant what he said to Lena. He hadn't done anything special. But standing there in the diner, feeling the resistance of a room that didn't want to be called out for its cruelty, Ethan had understood something about courage. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was deciding that something else mattered more. Earth to Walker. Danny appeared beside him, holding 2x4s that needed cutting. You gonna measure these or just stare at them until they cut themselves? Ethan took the boards and got to work, letting the familiar rhythm of measuring, marking, cutting settle his thoughts. This he understood. Wood and tools and the satisfaction of building something that would last. The rest of the world, the complicated mess of people and emotions, and trying to do right when right wasn't clearly defined, that was harder. At lunch, Ethan sat apart from the crew, eating the sandwich Sophie had helped him make that morning. She'd insisted on adding pickles because pickles were important, even though Ethan had pointed out he didn't like pickles. 7-year-old logic was unassailable. He pulled out his phone and texted his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who picked Sophie up from school on days when Ethan's work ran late. How's she doing? The response came quickly. Perfect as always, we're making cookies. She says they're for you, but she's eaten most of the dough. Ethan smiled, typed back, Save me one if you can, and felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Sophie was his center, his reason for everything, the job that destroyed his back, the side work that stole his weekends, the constant calculation of whether they had enough money for school supplies and groceries, and the million small expenses that came with raising a child alone. It was all for her. And this morning, standing in that diner, he'd been thinking about her, about the woman she'd become, the lessons she'd learned about how to treat people and how to demand treatment in return. If Sophie had been the waitress, if someone had humiliated her in front of a crowd, Ethan would have wanted someone to speak up, would have prayed that one person in that room would have the courage to say, this isn't okay, this isn't right, this isn't who we should be. So he'd been that person for someone else's daughter. And maybe somewhere, someday, someone would be that person for his. You really okay? Big Mike had appeared beside him, lowering his bulk onto the concrete with a grunt. "You've been weird all day." Ethan considered lying again, but Big Mike had a way of seeing through bullshit. "Had a situation this morning at the diner I go to. A waitress was in pain, muscle soreness from working out, and people laughed at her, made assumptions. I said something about it." Big Mike was quiet for a long moment, chewing his own sandwich with the deliberation of someone thinking through a problem. "You say something or you say something?" I stood up, made a speech, called out the whole room. "Damn," Big Mike whistled low. "That takes stones. It was the right thing to do." "Sure, but right doesn't always mean easy." Big Mike studied him with those sharp eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by simple explanations. "This waitress means something to you?" "I don't even know her. Just seen her serve me breakfast for the past 6 months. But you know her enough to risk looking like an idiot in front of strangers." It wasn't a question. Ethan set down his sandwich, appetite suddenly gone. "I know what it's like to work through pain, to show up when your body's screaming at you to stay home because quitting isn't an option. And I know what it's like to be judged for things people assume rather than things they know." Big Mike nodded slowly. "After Maria left you." The words hung between them. Ethan rarely talked about his wife's death, and even fewer people knew the whispers that had followed. That Sarah had been having an affair, that she'd left him, that the aneurysm was just a story to save face. None of it true, but truth mattered less than gossip in small communities. "People talked," Ethan said flatly. "Made up stories about why a healthy 31-year-old woman just drops dead. Couldn't accept that sometimes shit just happens. Had to create drama, assign blame, turn tragedy into entertainment." "And nobody stood up for you?" "No." The admission still stung 3 years later. People I'd known my whole life, people I'd worked beside and trusted. They all just let the rumors spread. Let me become the villain in a story that didn't have one. Big Mike finished his sandwich, crumpled the wrapper with deliberate care. "So you stood up for someone else, made sure she didn't have to go through what you did." "I guess." "That's not guessing, Walker. That's knowing. That's being the person you needed when you were drowning." Big Mike stood, joints popping in protest. "For what it's worth, I think you did right. World needs more people who speak up instead of shut up." He walked away before Ethan could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his half-eaten sandwich, and the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, this morning had mattered more than he'd realized. The rest of the workday passed without incident. Ethan framed walls, hung drywall, did the physical labor that kept his body strong and his mind mercifully empty. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, he was exhausted in the good way. Muscles worked, job done, paycheck earned. He picked up Sophie from Mrs. Chen's house, endured her detailed explanation of why chocolate chips were scientifically superior to raisins and cookies, and drove them home to the small house he'd bought with Sarah, back when they'd believed in futures and plans and growing old together. The house was too big for just 2 people, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to sell it. Sophie had been born here. Sarah had died here. Their lives were written into the walls, and abandoning it felt like abandoning her memory. "Daddy, you're quiet," Sophie observed as they pulled into the driveway. She'd inherited Sarah's perceptiveness, along with her dark curls and stubborn chin. "Did something bad happen?" "No, Sweet Pea. Something good happened, actually. Just trying to figure out what it means." Sophie unbuckled herself and climbed into the front seat, a maneuver Ethan had told her 100 times was unsafe, but she did anyway because 7-year-olds were equal parts fearless and foolish. She studied his face with the intensity of a child who'd learned to read her father's moods because her survival had sometimes depended on it. "You look sad happy," she announced. "Like when you talk about Mommy." Ethan's chest tightened. "I'm not sad, Soph, just thinking." "About what?" How did he explain this morning to a 7-year-old? How did he talk about cruelty and courage and the complicated ways that strangers could matter? "I helped someone today," he finally said. "Someone who needed help." "Like a superhero?" "Not quite. More like, I saw something wrong, and I said something about it." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Did you fight a bad guy?" "No fighting, just talking. Sometimes words are more powerful than fists. She considered this with the seriousness of someone evaluating a fundamental truth. Mrs. Chen says words can hurt more than hitting. Mrs. Chen is very smart. She also says I talk too much, but I think she's wrong about that. Sophie climbed back into her seat as they pulled into the garage. Are you going to help the person again? Ethan cut the engine and sat in the sudden silence. Was he going to help Lena again? He'd given her his card, had told her to call if she needed anything. But that was just politeness, wasn't it? The kind of gesture you make because it's expected, not because you actually anticipate follow-through. Except he'd come back to check on her, had stood in that parking lot and given her his number with genuine intent, had meant it when he'd said, call me if you need something. I don't know, Sweet Pea, he admitted. Maybe, if she needs it. You should. Sophie unbuckled and opened her door. Superheroes don't just help once. They keep helping until the person doesn't need help anymore. She skipped into the house, already calling out what she wanted for dinner, leaving Ethan alone in the truck to marvel at how children could make everything sound so simple. Keep helping until the person doesn't need help anymore. As if it were that easy. As if you could just decide to be present in someone's life and have that be enough. But maybe it was that simple. Maybe courage wasn't one grand gesture, but a series of small decisions to keep showing up, keep speaking up, keep giving a damn when apathy would be easier. Ethan grabbed his lunchbox and headed inside, where Sophie was already laying out her homework on the kitchen table with the organizational precision of a tiny general planning a campaign. We're having spaghetti, she informed him. Not a question, a decree. We had Spaghetti Tuesday. And it was Good Tuesday, so it'll be good today. That's science, Daddy. Ethan couldn't argue with 7-year-old science, so he started pulling out pots and ingredients while Sophie narrated her day in exhaustive detail. Who said what at recess, how the class hamster had escaped again, why her teacher was wrong about multiplication tables being important. This was his life now. Had been for 3 years, single father, blue-collar worker, widower trying to raise a daughter who was smarter and stronger than he'd ever been. It was small and simple and enough most days. But something about this morning had cracked open a space inside him, a reminder that his life wasn't separate from the world, that what he did mattered beyond these walls and this child and this carefully constructed routine. He'd stood up for someone, had used his voice, had refused to let cruelty be the final word. And it had felt good, terrifying and uncomfortable and good. While the water boiled and Sophie worked through her homework with theatrical sighs, Ethan's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello? Mr. Walker, this is Marcus Webb. I was at the diner this morning. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. Marcus, the man at the counter who'd been one of the first to laugh, whose snort of amusement had given permission for everyone else to join in. What can I do for you? Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. I wanted to, Jesus, this is harder than I thought. Marcus took a breath. I wanted to apologize. Not to the waitress. I mean, I should apologize to her too, but right now I'm apologizing to you. You don't need to apologize to me. I'm not the one you hurt. No, but you're the one who had the balls to call us out on it. Marcus's voice was tight with emotion. I've been thinking about it all day. About what you said. About how quick we were to judge. About how if it had been a man saying he was sore from working out, we would have sympathized instead of mocked. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching Sophie's pencil move across her homework. So, what changed? My daughter came home from school today and told me about a boy in her class who made fun of her for being bad at kickball. She was devastated, crying, asking why people were mean. Marcus's voice cracked, and I realized I'm teaching her, whether I mean to or not. I'm showing her that it's okay to laugh at someone else's pain as long as everyone else is doing it. Kids learn what we show them, Ethan said quietly. Yeah, they do. And I don't want her to learn that cruelty is acceptable if it's popular. Marcus cleared his throat. So I'm calling to say thank you for standing up, for making me look at myself and not like what I saw, for reminding me that I'm supposed to be better than that. Ethan didn't know what to say. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe someone calling to tell him to mind his own business, not this raw honesty from a stranger trying to do better. Your daughter's lucky to have a father who cares about this, Ethan finally managed. I hope so, I'm trying, anyway. Marcus paused. The waitress, Lena, I think her name is, do you know if she's okay? I think she will be. She's stronger than people gave her credit for. Good. That's good. Another pause. If you see her again, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'll do better. They hung up shortly after, and Ethan stood in his kitchen trying to process the conversation. One person calling to apologize. One person choosing to change. It wasn't redemption for the whole room, but it was something. Daddy, the water's boiling over, Sophie's voice cut through his thoughts. Ethan rushed to turn down the heat, catching the pot before it made a mess. Crisis averted, spaghetti salvaged, Thursday evening returning to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted. Some understanding that his actions rippled outward in ways he couldn't predict or control. He'd stood up for a stranger and somehow, inadvertently, had planted seeds of change in people he'd never see again. Marcus would go home and be a better father to his daughter. Dorothy had called Lena to apologize properly. Even Rick, the manager who'd spent 11 months treating Lena like furniture, had given her 2 days off and told her to rest. One voice in a silent room, that's all it had taken. Later that night, after Sophie was in bed and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Ethan sat on his back porch and looked at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have said about this morning. She would have been proud, he decided. Sarah had always been the brave one, the first to speak up when something wasn't right. She would have stood up in that diner without hesitation, would have defended Lena with the fierce certainty of someone who'd never learned to stay silent. And she would have told Ethan that one moment of courage didn't erase the fact that he'd spent most of his life being quiet, being safe, choosing comfort over confrontation. But maybe that was okay. Maybe you didn't have to be brave all the time to be brave when it mattered. His phone sat on the porch railing, dark and silent. Somewhere across town, Lena Brooks had his number. Would she call? Would she need something? Would this morning be the beginning of something or just a moment that faded into the past like everything else? Ethan didn't know. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like maybe his life could be about more than just surviving. Maybe there was room for connection, for meaning, for the possibility that two strangers brought together by circumstance could matter to each other in ways neither had planned. The night air was cool against his face. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. The city breathed around him, full of people living their own dramas, fighting their own battles, making their own choices about whether to speak up or stay silent. Ethan had made his choice, and whatever came next, he'd make that choice again. Because Sophie was watching, because Lena had needed someone, because the world was full of moments where doing nothing was easy and doing something required courage you didn't know you had. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Friday morning arrived with rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be a drizzle or a downpour, settling instead for that persistent dampness that soaked through everything without quite announcing itself. Lena woke to the sound of it against her window, her legs still sore but improved enough that walking to the bathroom no longer felt like a heroic endeavor. She made coffee in the pot that took 10 minutes to brew and produced something that was more caffeine delivery system than actual beverage. Standing at her kitchen window, watching rain streak the glass, she pulled out her phone and stared at Ethan's contact information for the 3rd time since yesterday. What do you say to someone who changed your life in 15 minutes? The cursor blinked in the empty text field, patient and judgmental in equal measure. Lena typed, "Thank you again," then deleted it. Typed, "I've been thinking about what you did," and deleted that too. Everything sounded either too casual or too intense, missing some middle ground where gratitude could exist without obligation. She set the phone down and tried to focus on her day off, the luxury of hours that belonged only to her, no customers to serve, no humiliation to endure, just time stretching out like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. But the phone kept drawing her attention, Ethan's name sitting there like an unanswered question. Finally, around noon, she typed, "This is Lena from the diner. I wanted to let you know that people have been reaching out, apologizing. You started something that's still rippling. Thank you for that." She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately regretted every word choice. Too formal? Not formal enough? Did it sound like she expected a response? The reply came faster than she anticipated. Glad to hear it. How are your legs? Lena smiled despite herself. Leave it to Ethan to cut through the awkwardness and ask about the practical concern that had started everything. Better. Day 3 of soreness is supposed to be the worst, right? That's what they say. Ice helps, and ibuprofen. And accepting that you made terrible life choices when you decided Bulgarian split squats were a good idea. I'm starting to suspect my trainer hates me. All good trainers hate their clients a little bit. It's part of the job description. The conversation continued in fits and starts throughout the afternoon, never quite developing into a real exchange, but maintaining a thread of connection that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. Ethan sent a photo of Sophie covered in paint from an art project gone wrong. Lena shared a picture of her view, the rain-soaked parking lot and gray sky that somehow looked peaceful in the right light. They weren't quite friends, weren't quite strangers anymore either. They existed in that liminal space of people who'd shared something significant and were now trying to figure out what, if anything, came next. Around 3, Lena's phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call. The screen showed Rick's name, and her stomach immediately tightened with the old anxiety of something must be wrong. Hello? Lena, it's Rick. You got a minute? Sure. Is everything okay? Yeah, fine. He cleared his throat in that way people do when they're about to say something uncomfortable. I wanted to talk to you about what happened Thursday, about what I should have done differently. Lena sat down on her couch, rain drumming a steady rhythm against the window. Rick, you gave me 2 days off. You don't need to... Let me say this. His voice was firm but not unkind. I've been managing that diner for 23 years. 23 years of dealing with customers and staff, and all the bullshit that comes with running a place that serves breakfast to people who'd rather still be sleeping. You know what I learned in all that time? What? How to look without seeing, how to hear without listening, how to let things slide because dealing with them was harder than ignoring them. He paused, and Lena could picture him in the diner's office, surrounded by schedules and invoices and the accumulated paperwork of 2 decades. That guy Thursday, Ethan, I think his name was, he didn't just call out the customers. He called out me too. Maybe not directly, but the message was clear. I failed you. You didn't. I did. You've worked for me for 11 months, Lena. 11 months of showing up on time, doing your job, dealing with difficult customers without complaint. And the first time something went wrong, the first time you needed someone to have your back, I told you to clean it up and keep moving. Like you were the problem instead of the victim. The word hung between them. Victim. Lena had been trying not to think of herself that way, had been working hard to reframe Thursday as a learning experience or a wake-up call or anything except what it actually was. A moment of public humiliation that she'd done nothing to deserve. I've been doing inventory all day, Rick continued, which gives you a lot of time to think, and I kept coming back to something my wife said to me last night. She asked me when I stopped seeing my staff as people and started seeing them as functions. When did Lena become the morning waitress instead of a 23-year-old woman trying to make rent while working a job that pays shit and treats her worse? Lena's throat tightened. Rick, I don't have a good answer for that. Maybe it happened gradually, so slowly I didn't notice. Maybe it happened all at once and I just didn't want to admit it, but either way it happened. And I'm sorry. The apology was clumsy and sincere, and so unexpected that Lena felt tears pricking at her eyes for what felt like the 100th time in 2 days. What changed? She asked quietly. Why are you telling me this now? Because that man stood up in a room full of people and did what I should have done. Because my wife reminded me that I used to be better than this. Because you deserve to work somewhere that treats you like you matter. He took a breath. I can't give you a raise. The margins on this place barely keep us afloat as it is. But I can give you respect, better scheduling, a voice in how things run. And I can promise that if something like Thursday ever happens again, I'll be the first one standing up, not the last one making excuses. Lena wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Thank you. That means a lot. Don't thank me for doing what I should have been doing all along. There was a rustling of papers, the sound of Rick shifting in his chair. When you come back Saturday, we'll talk about cross-training you for other positions. Maybe some kitchen work, some administrative stuff. Waitressing doesn't have to be your ceiling unless you want it to be. After they hung up, Lena sat in the silence of her apartment and tried to process the fundamental shift occurring in her world. 2 days ago, she'd been invisible. Now people were calling to apologize. Her manager was offering her opportunities, and a stranger's phone number sat in her contacts like a promise of something she couldn't quite name. The rain had finally committed to being a downpour, sheets of water turning the world outside her window into an impressionist painting. Lena pulled a blanket around her shoulders and let herself feel the full weight of the past 2 days. She'd been broken open, humiliated in front of dozens of people, reduced to a punchline, made to feel small and shameful for something as mundane as muscle soreness. But she'd also been defended, seen, valued, fought for by someone who had no obligation to fight, who'd risked social discomfort because doing nothing felt worse than speaking up. And now the aftershocks were still spreading, people changing, apologizing, trying to be better. One voice in a silent room. That's all it had taken. Lena picked up her phone and texted Ethan. Rick just called. He apologized, said he's going to train me for other positions. The response came quickly. That's great. You deserve opportunities. I don't know if I deserve them. I just show up and do my job. That's exactly why you deserve them. Showing up is half the battle. Showing up when things are hard is most of it. Lena smiled at the screen at this stranger who seemed to understand something fundamental about survival that most people missed. Is that what you do? Just keep showing up? Pretty much. For 3 years now. Some days it's all I can manage, getting Sophie to school, getting myself to work, getting us both home in one piece. But we show up, and eventually showing up becomes living. Does it get easier? There was a longer pause before his response. No, but you get stronger, which isn't the same thing, but maybe it's better. They texted sporadically for the rest of the day, the conversation meandering through topics both heavy and light. Ethan told her about Sophie's obsession with dinosaurs and her conviction that vegetables were a conspiracy invented by adults. Lena shared stories about her worst customers and the regular who'd been leaving increasingly elaborate drawings on his napkins for months. By evening, Lena realized she'd gone hours without thinking about Thursday's humiliation. The memory was still there, still tender, but it no longer consumed all the oxygen in her mind. There was room now for other things. Possibility. Connection. The tentative hope that maybe life could surprise you in good ways too. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp air that promised spring might actually be coming. Lena dressed for work with more care than usual, aware that she was returning to the scene of her humiliation and wanting to feel armored against whatever might come. The diner looked the same as always, same cracked vinyl booths, same buzzing neon sign, same smell of burnt coffee and possibility. But when Lena walked through the door, something was different. Rick was behind the counter, and he looked up immediately. Lena, welcome back. You're looking good. The words were simple, almost generic, but the way he said them, with actual attention, actual notice, transformed them into something more. Thanks. Legs are almost back to normal. Good. That's good. Rick gestured toward the back. Listen, before you clock in, come talk to me in the office for a minute. I want to go over some things. Lena followed him to the cramped office that smelled like old coffee and ancient paperwork. Rick closed the door and gestured for her to sit in the chair usually reserved for employees being disciplined. I meant what I said on the phone, he began without preamble. About cross-training, about giving you more opportunities. I talked to corporate, and they're willing to create a shift supervisor position. It's not a huge raise, $1.50 an hour, but it comes with some authority and the possibility of moving into management if that's something you want. Lena stared at him. A shift supervisor position? Rick, I've only been here 11 months. And you've been reliable for all 11 of them. You show up, you work hard. You don't create drama. That's more than I can say for half my staff. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. Look, I'm not doing this out of guilt. Well, maybe a little out of guilt, but mostly because I realized I've been wasting talent by not paying attention. You're better than this job, Lena, but while you're here, you might as well learn something and get paid a little more for it. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Talk to me Monday with questions. For today, just work your normal shift and let me know if anyone gives you trouble."
"You think someone will?" Rick's expression darkened. "Most of the customers from Thursday haven't been back, but people talk. Word gets around. I want you to know that if anyone makes you uncomfortable, if anyone references what happened, you come get me immediately. That's not a request." Lena felt something warm spread through her chest. Protection. That's what Rick was offering. The thing he should have given her Thursday, but was determined to give her now. "Okay. Thank you." She clocked in and started her shift, moving through the familiar choreography of taking orders and pouring coffee. The lunch rush was lighter than usual, several regulars conspicuously absent, their usual tables empty. But new faces had appeared. People Lena didn't recognize, sitting in booths and ordering food with the casual ease of customers who'd been coming here for years. One of them, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and laugh lines, caught Lena's attention as she passed. "Excuse me, are you Lena?" Lena froze, immediately on guard. "Yes. Can I help you?" "I hope so. My name's Patricia. I heard about what happened here Thursday, about what some customers did and what one customer said in response." She smiled, and it was genuine, reaching her eyes. "I wanted to come give my business to a place that apparently has staff worth defending." Lena felt her face flush. "You came here because of what happened?" "I came here because I'm tired of places that tolerate cruelty. If this diner has customers brave enough to call it out and management willing to back their staff, then this is where I want to eat my Saturday lunch." Patricia opened her menu with decisive satisfaction. "Plus, I hear the hash browns are excellent." "They're pretty good," Lena managed, still processing the fact that someone had sought out Franklin Street because of Thursday's incident. Over the next hour, 3 more new customers came in with similar stories. They'd heard about the diner where someone had stood up for a waitress. They wanted to support that, wanted to vote with their dollars for the kind of world where cruelty didn't go unchallenged. Lena served them in a daze, overwhelmed by the realization that her worst moment had somehow become advertising, that people were choosing this diner not despite what happened, but because of how it resolved. Around 3, during a lull in the afternoon crowd, Rick approached her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Someone's asking for you," he said quietly. "Table 9. Said he's a friend." Lena looked over to the window booth, Ethan's usual spot. And there he sat, reading his phone with that same focused intensity, coffee cup steaming in front of him. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. "Go ahead," Rick said, a knowing smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Take a break. Talk to your friend." Lena walked over to the booth, suddenly aware of every step, every movement, the fact that she was approaching the man who'd defended her with no plan for what to say. Ethan looked up as she approached, and his face broke into a smile that transformed his features from tired to genuinely warm. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi yourself." Lena gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Mind if I sit?" "I was hoping you would." She slid into the booth, acutely aware of the diner around them, of the possibility that someone was watching this interaction with interest or speculation. But when she met Ethan's eyes, the rest of the room seemed to fade. "You didn't have to come," Lena said quietly. "I know this isn't your usual day. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Your first shift back, I figured—" He shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the things he wasn't saying about concern and support and the desire to be present. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. Rick offered me a supervisor position. New customers are coming in because they heard about Thursday. It's weird and overwhelming, and I still can't quite process it." "You're allowed to take time processing. You went through something traumatic." "So did you. Standing up like that, calling out a room full of people, that couldn't have been easy." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, considering his words. "It was terrifying. I'm not good at confrontation. I'm the guy who avoids conflict, who keeps his head down and minds his business. But watching what they did to you—" He stopped, jaw working. "I couldn't be that person anymore. Couldn't be the guy who stays silent because speaking up is uncomfortable." "What changed?" "Sophie, mostly. She's growing up in a world that's going to judge her, criticize her, try to make her small. And I realize that every time I stay silent in the face of cruelty, I'm teaching her that silence is acceptable,
that protecting yourself is more important than protecting others. Lena reached across the table and took his hand without thinking, a gesture of connection that felt both natural and momentous. His hand was warm, calloused, solid. "You're a good father," she said softly. "I'm trying to be. Most days I feel like I'm failing, but I keep showing up and hoping that's enough. It is enough. Trust me, showing up is everything." They sat like that for a moment, hands clasped across the table, two people who'd been strangers 48 hours ago and now felt like something more. Not quite friends, not quite anything easily defined, but connected by circumstance and choice in ways that mattered. "Lena!" Rick's voice cut through the moment. "Got a table needs attention." Lena pulled her hand back, immediately missing the warmth of Ethan's touch. "I should get back to work." "I know, but before you go..." Ethan pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, and then looked at her with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "I just sent you something. Don't read it now. Read it tonight, when you're home and you have time to think." "Ethan, just trust me. Please." Lena nodded, tucked the mystery away to examine later, and returned to work with her mind spinning and her heart doing acrobatics she didn't quite understand. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of orders and conversations, and the steady rhythm of work that felt different now that she knew opportunities existed beyond it. Rick caught her eye several times, nodding approval when she handled difficult customers with grace. New patrons asked her questions about Thursday, and she answered honestly. It had been awful. It had been transformative. It had shown her both the worst and best of humanity in the span of 15 minutes. By the time her shift ended at 8, Lena was exhausted in the good way, the way that comes from work that matters and interactions that feel genuine. She clocked out, said goodbye to Rick, and walked to her car through air that smelled like possibility and approaching spring. Only when she was home, showered, and settled on her couch with tea, she rarely bothered making did she pull out her phone and open Ethan's message. It was long, formatted like a letter, and reading it made her throat tight with emotion. "Lena, I'm not good at this kind of thing. Not good at reaching out, at making connections, at letting people in. For 3 years, I've kept my world small. Sophie, work, the routines that keep us safe. I've told myself that small is enough, that wanting more is selfish when I have a daughter who needs stability. But meeting you, standing up for you, seeing how that one moment rippled out into change I couldn't predict, it reminded me that life is supposed to be bigger than just surviving. That connection matters. That sometimes taking a risk is worth it even when the outcome is uncertain. I don't know what this is. I don't know if we're friends, or if we could be something more, or if I'm completely misreading the situation. But I know that I think about you more than is probably appropriate for someone I've had 2 real conversations with. I know that when my phone buzzes, I hope it's you. I know that sitting in that booth today, holding your hand, felt like the first time in 3 years that I've been fully present instead of just going through motions. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not expecting anything. I just wanted you to know that you matter. That what happened Thursday mattered. That you changed something in me, even though I was supposed to be the one helping you. If you want to get coffee sometime, real coffee, not the burnt stuff at Franklin Street, I'd like that. If you want to keep texting about nothing in particular, I'd like that too. If you need space to process everything that's happened, I understand completely. Whatever you decide, thank you for letting me be part of your story, for giving me the chance to be brave when I usually choose safe, for reminding me that showing up for other people is just as important as showing up for myself. Ethan. Lena read it 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of vulnerability and honesty that took her breath away. This man, this quiet, careful man who built things with his hands and raised a daughter alone and spoke up when speaking up cost him something, was laying himself bare in a text message. And she realized, sitting in her threadbare apartment with tea going cold in her hands, that she wanted to say yes. Yes to coffee. Yes to whatever this connection was becoming. Yes to the possibility that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things if you're brave enough to let them. She typed back, "Coffee sounds perfect. How about Sunday afternoon? And Ethan, you didn't just remind me that showing up matters. You showed me what it looks like when someone shows up for someone else. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for everything." His response came immediately. "Sunday afternoon it is. I'll pick you up at 2? I'll be ready. Lena set down her phone and let herself smile, really smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine. In the span of 3 days, her life had cracked open. She'd been humiliated and defended and offered opportunities and found connection in the most unexpected place. The universe had broken her down and built her back up, and standing in the rubble of who she'd been, Lena discovered she liked who she was becoming. Stronger, braver, willing to take risks on strangers who turned out to be exactly what she needed. And somewhere across town, Ethan was probably telling Sophie about the coffee date, enduring her 7-year-old interrogation about whether Lena was his girlfriend, trying to explain that sometimes adults just have coffee without it meaning anything specific even though it meant everything. 2 people. 1 moment. Infinite ripples spreading outward into lives they'd never touch, changes they'd never see, proof that courage was contagious and kindness could compound. The rain had stopped. The night was clear, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lena fell asleep feeling genuinely hopeful about tomorrow. Sunday morning dawned with the kind of brightness that felt almost aggressive after days of rain, sunlight streaming through Lena's apartment windows with an insistence that made sleeping in impossible. She woke at 9, which was late for someone whose body had been trained by years of early shifts to rise with the dawn, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling while her mind raced through every possible scenario for the afternoon. Coffee with Ethan. Just coffee. 2 people who'd shared something significant, trying to figure out if that significance extended beyond a single moment of crisis. Lena had been on dates before, awkward dinners with men from dating apps who'd spent the entire meal talking about themselves, uncomfortable drinks with coworkers who'd misread professional friendliness as romantic interest, one particularly disastrous relationship with a guy who'd left her for someone less complicated 3 months in. None of those experiences had prepared her for this strange intensity, this feeling that coffee with Ethan Walker mattered in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She spent longer than necessary choosing an outfit, finally settling on jeans and a sweater that looked casual but intentional, the kind of thing that said I put in effort without trying too hard. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed someone who looked nervous and hopeful in equal measure, and Lena decided that was probably the best she could manage. At 1:30, her phone buzzed. Ethan. Sophie insists on meeting you before we go. Is that okay? I can tell her no, but she's convinced you're either a superhero or a princess and won't rest until she confirms which. Lena laughed out loud, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. She typed back, I'd love to meet her. Fair warning, though. I'm neither a superhero nor a princess. I'll let her decide that for herself. See you at 2. When 2 o'clock arrived, Lena was waiting outside her apartment building, keys in hand and heart doing complicated gymnastics in her chest. Ethan's green pickup pulled up exactly on time, and through the windshield she could see Sophie in the back seat, pressed against the window with the urgent curiosity of a child who'd been promised something interesting. Ethan got out, and Lena was struck again by how different he looked in the clear light of day. Less tired somehow, or maybe just more present, like he'd given himself permission to exist fully instead of just functioning. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt that looked freshly ironed, and Lena realized with a flutter of warmth that he'd put in effort too. Hi, he said, that same simple greeting that had started their parking lot conversation. Hi. Lena gestured to the truck. Should I meet the interrogator? Probably safer to get it over with now. She's been practicing her questions all morning. Lena approached the passenger side, where Sophie had her face practically pressed against the glass. Up close, the resemblance to the photo Ethan had shared was striking. Those dark curls, those eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, that expression of fierce intelligence mixed with childish excitement. Ethan opened the door, and Sophie immediately launched into her prepared speech. Hi, I'm Sophie, and I'm 7.5, and my dad says you're the lady from the diner and that you were brave even when people were being mean, and I wanted to meet you to see if you're actually brave or if Dad was exaggerating, because sometimes he exaggerates, like when he said the movie was only a little scary, but it was actually very scary. The words came out in a rush, barely pausing for breath, and Lena found herself smiling so wide her face hurt. Hi, Sophie. I'm Lena, and I'm 23 and I work at a diner, and I'm not sure I was brave so much as your dad was brave for me. Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone evaluating crucial evidence. Were you scared? Very scared. But you didn't run away. I couldn't. I was working. And Dad helped you? He did. He stood up in front of everyone and said I didn't do anything wrong. Sophie nodded, satisfied. That's brave. Both of you were brave. Being scared but doing the thing anyway is basically the definition. She said it with the authority of someone quoting a trusted source, probably a children's book or an animated movie that had explained courage in terms she could understand. Your daughter is very wise, Lena said to Ethan, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement. She gets that from her mother. The unstoppable confidence is all her own. He gently guided Sophie back into her car seat. Soph, we're going to drop you at Mrs. Chen's now, remember? I know, but can Lena come to dinner sometime? I want to show her my dinosaur collection and my drawing of the solar system that Mr. Peterson said was very accurate, even though I made Saturn's rings purple instead of beige because beige is boring. We'll see, Ethan said, which Lena recognized as parent speak for maybe, but I'm not committing to anything yet. That means yes, Sophie informed Lena with the confidence of someone who'd cracked her father's code long ago. When he says we'll see in that voice, it always means yes eventually. 20 minutes later, after dropping Sophie at Mrs. Chen's house where she'd immediately begun explaining her latest theory about why dinosaurs were better than mammals, Ethan and Lena sat across from each other in a coffee shop that was trying very hard to be trendy. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs, a chalkboard menu featuring drinks with names like The Existentialist and Liquid Meditation. It was the opposite of Franklin Street Diner in every way, and somehow that felt appropriate. A neutral space where they could be just two people instead of waitress and defender, victim and hero, all the roles that had defined their first encounter. Sophie's amazing, Lena said after they'd ordered, plain coffee for Ethan, a latte with an embarrassing amount of vanilla for Lena. She's a handful, smart enough to know exactly which buttons to push, confident enough to push them repeatedly. But Ethan's voice was warm with affection. She's been asking about you since I mentioned we were getting coffee. Wanted to know if you were pretty, if you were nice, if you liked dinosaurs. I think she's vetting you for friend potential. Friend potential? Ethan's ears went slightly red. She doesn't have a lot of women in her life. My mother died 2 years ago. Sarah's parents moved to Florida after everything. Mrs. Chen is wonderful, but she's 80 and mostly interested in teaching Sophie to cook and garden. I think Sophie's hungry for female presence, someone younger who can relate to her world. I don't know if I'm qualified for that. I don't know anything about kids. Neither did I when Sophie was born. Still don't, honestly. I just show up and hope I'm not screwing her up too badly. He took a sip of coffee, grimaced slightly at the heat. But that's parenthood, I guess. Constant low-level terror that you're failing mixed with moments of pure joy when you realize they're turning out okay despite you. Their coffee arrived, delivered by a barista with purple hair and more piercings than Lena could count. In the corner, someone was working on a laptop with the intense focus of either a novelist or someone very behind on their emails. Jazz played softly through speakers, the kind of instrumental music designed to be noticed but not intrusive. Can I ask you something? Lena wrapped her hands around her latte, savoring the warmth. Why did you really come back to the diner Thursday morning, after you'd already left? Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with the care of someone who'd learned that words mattered. Honestly, because I've spent 3 years learning what it's like when nobody shows up for you. When your wife dies and people whisper instead of helping. When you're drowning and everyone just assumes you know how to swim because asking would be awkward. He met her eyes, and she saw pain there, old and deep but managed. I came back because I know what it feels like to need someone and have everyone look away. And I couldn't do that to you, couldn't let you sit in that diner wondering if what happened was your fault, if you'd done something to deserve it. You needed to know someone was on your side. You didn't owe me that? No, but maybe that's the point. We don't owe each other basic decency. We just give it because that's what decent people do. Lena felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I've spent so long feeling invisible, like I was just background noise in other people's lives. And then you saw me, really saw me. Do you have any idea how rare that is? I think we see what we're looking for. And I've been looking for people who keep showing up despite the pain because that's what I've had to do. You were limping through your shift, working through agony, doing your job because quitting wasn't an option. I recognized that. I recognized you. The conversation shifted then, moving away from the intensity of Thursday and into the easier territory of getting to know each other. Ethan told her about his carpentry work, the satisfaction of building furniture that would outlast him, the meditative quality of working with wood. Lena shared her dreams of going back to school someday, maybe studying social work or education, something where she could help people the way she'd been helped. They talked about movies and music and the small details that build a life, Ethan's terrible cooking skills, Lena's collection of plants she kept killing despite her best efforts, the way they both felt slightly out of place in a world that seemed designed for people with more money and fewer complications. 2 hours passed without Lena noticing, the coffee shop filling and emptying around them while they existed in their own bubble of conversation. It wasn't a date exactly, or maybe it was, but neither of them wanted to name it, to put pressure on something still too fragile to bear weight. Finally, Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked it and sighed. "Mrs. Chen, Sophie wants to know if we're coming back soon because she made cookies and they're getting cold." She made cookies in 2 hours? Sophie is extraordinarily food motivated. It's both impressive and concerning. He stood, reached for his wallet, but Lena stopped him. "I've got this. You bought breakfast at the diner for 6 months. It's my turn." They drove back to Mrs. Chen's house with the windows down, spring air rushing through the truck, and carrying with it the promise of warmth to come. Sophie met them at the door holding a plate of cookies that were lopsided but appeared edible. "I made these myself," she announced. "Well, Mrs. Chen helped with the oven part because I'm not allowed to touch the oven unsupervised until I'm 8, which is very unfair but apparently based on safety regulations." She said the last part in a tone that suggested she'd been quoting an adult and found their reasoning lacking. Lana took a cookie and bit into it. It was sweet, slightly burnt on the bottom, absolutely perfect. "These are delicious," Sophie beamed. "Dad, can Lena stay for dinner? Mrs. Chen is making dumplings and she always makes too many, and you said I could have a friend over sometime, and Lena's my friend now, so that counts." Ethan looked at Lena, a question in his eyes. She should say no, should maintain boundaries, take things slow, not rush into the complicated territory of family dinners and bonding with 7-year-olds. Instead, she said, "I'd love to stay, if that's okay." "More than okay," Ethan said quietly, and the warmth in his voice made Lena's chest tight. Dinner at Mrs. Chen's was chaos in the best way. The elderly woman had indeed made too many dumplings, and she peppered Lena with questions while Sophie provided running commentary on everything from the proper way to fold dumplings to why her father was terrible at chopsticks despite years of practice. "He holds them like a caveman," Sophie explained seriously. "Mrs. Chen has tried to teach him, but he's hopeless." "I can hear you," Ethan said mildly, struggling with a particularly slippery dumpling. "I know, I'm hoping public shaming will motivate improvement." Mrs. Chen laughed, a sound like wind chimes, and patted Lena's hand. "Ethan tells me you work hard, that you keep showing up even when it's difficult. That's good. Too many people today give up when things get hard." "I don't know if I have a choice," Lena admitted. "Giving up means losing my apartment, losing my job, losing the small stability I've built. So I show up. Choice or not, you do it. That matters." Mrs. Chen served her more dumplings despite Lena's protests that she was full. "And now Ethan has shown up for you. Good. Everyone needs someone to show up sometimes." After dinner, Sophie insisted on showing Lena her dinosaur collection, which was extensive and organized with the precision of a museum curator. Each plastic dinosaur had a name, a personality, and apparently a complex social hierarchy that Sophie explained in exhaustive detail. "This is Reginald. He's a T-Rex, but he's vegetarian because he doesn't like the taste of meat. The other dinosaurs think he's weird, but I think he's brave for being different." Lena knelt beside Sophie's carefully arranged prehistoric world and felt something shift in her chest. This child, with her fierce intelligence and unshakable confidence, was part of Ethan's world, and Ethan was cautiously inviting Lena into that world,
letting her see the life he'd built from the ruins of his loss. When it was time to leave, Sophie hugged Lena with the unselfconscious affection of someone who'd already decided they were friends. "You should come back. Next Sunday we could go to the park, and I could show you my favorite climbing tree." "We'll see," Ethan said again, and Sophie shot Lena a knowing look that said, "Told you so." Ethan drove Lena home through streets that had gone quiet with evening, the radio playing soft classic rock that filled the comfortable silence between them. When they pulled up in front of her apartment building, neither of them moved to leave immediately. "Thank you for today," Lena finally said, "for coffee and dinner and letting me into your life. I know that's not easy, especially with Sophie." "It should be harder," Ethan admitted. 3 years I've kept everyone at arm's length, told myself that Sophie and I were enough. But today felt right. Easy. Like maybe I've been making things harder by staying closed off. Or maybe you were protecting yourself, protecting her. That's not wrong, Ethan. No, but it's not living either. It's just surviving. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the dashboard lights. "I don't know what this is. I don't know if we're building towards something or if we're just two people who shared a moment. But I want to find out. And if you do." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. "I want to find out too. I'm scared. I'm terrible at relationships. I overthink everything. I have more baggage than any 23-year-old should have. But I want to try. I'm scared too. I haven't been on a date in over a decade. I have a kid, a demanding job, and emotional walls I've spent 3 years building. But sitting here with you, I think maybe being scared is less important than being honest." They sat in the truck talking until the dashboard clock showed 11, until Lena's phone buzzed with a text from her upstairs neighbor asking if she was okay because they'd seen her sitting in a truck for an hour. They talked about fear and hope and the strange alchemy that happens when two people decide to be brave together. When Lena finally went inside, she felt different. Lighter. Like she'd been holding her breath for months and had finally remembered how to exhale. The next morning, Lena returned to Franklin Street Diner for her regular shift with shoulders squared and head high. The breakfast rush was in full swing, and she moved through it with practiced efficiency, taking orders and pouring coffee while conversation swirled around her. Several of the Thursday regulars had returned. The businessman with his laptop, the construction workers, even Marcus from the counter. Each of them made eye contact when she served them, some offering sheepish smiles, others leaving larger tips than necessary. The apologies were mostly silent, conveyed through gesture and money and the simple act of showing up without cruelty. Around 9, during a brief lull, Rick called her into his office again. "I've been thinking about that supervisor position," he said without preamble. "I want you to start training next week. Sarah, you know Sarah from the evening shift? She's moving to days, and I need someone who can handle the morning rush with authority." "Rick, thank you. I won't let you down." "I know you won't. You've been not letting me down for 11 months. I'm just finally paying attention." He shuffled papers on his desk, uncomfortable with sincerity. "And Lena?" "That guy, Ethan. He's been coming in every morning this week, always asks if you're working, always sits in the window booth. I think he's sweet on you." Lena felt her face heat. "We're just friends." "Sure you are. And I'm just a fry cook." But Rick was smiling. "Take your break. Go talk to your friend. But not too long. I still need you on the floor." Lena walked to the window booth where Ethan sat with his usual coffee and phone, though this time he looked up immediately when she approached. "Twice in 1 week," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "People are going to talk." "Let them talk. I'm done caring what people think." He pushed a paper bag across the table. "Sophie made you more cookies. These ones are less burnt." Lena opened the bag to find a dozen chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a napkin with a drawing of what appeared to be either a dinosaur or a very confused dog. A note in careful 7-year-old handwriting read, "For Lena, from your friend Sophie." "She made me write 'friend' 3 times before she decided it looked right," Ethan explained. "She takes correspondence very seriously." "Tell her thank you, and tell her yes to the park next Sunday." Ethan's face broke into that smile that transformed him. "Yeah?" "Yeah. I want to see this legendary climbing tree." They talked for the 15 minutes Lena's break allowed.
making plans for Sunday and swapping stories about their week. When Lena had to return to work, Ethan caught her hand briefly. "I'm glad you said yes, to coffee, to dinner, to all of it." "Me too." The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Ethan came to the diner every morning before work, occupying the window booth and providing steady, quiet presence. They texted throughout the day, sharing the small moments that build intimacy. Sophie's latest dinosaur theory. A difficult customer Lena had charmed. The furniture piece Ethan was building for a client. Sundays became their day. Sometimes it was the park with Sophie, watching her conquer climbing structures with fearless determination. Sometimes it was coffee while Sophie was at Mrs. Chen's, just the two of them talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes it was dinner at Ethan's house, Lena learning to cook alongside someone who burned water and found it funny rather than frustrating. Slowly, carefully, they built something that didn't have a name but felt solid anyway. Lena started her supervisor training and discovered she was good at it. Good at managing people, good at solving problems, good at creating the kind of work environment she'd wished for when she'd been invisible. She implemented new policies about customer conduct, trained staff on how to handle harassment, and made it clear that Franklin Street Diner was a place where everyone deserved respect. The diner's reputation grew. People came because they'd heard it was the place where someone had stood up, where cruelty had been called out, where a single moment of courage had created ripples that were still spreading. And through it all, Ethan and Lena navigated the complicated dance of becoming something more than friends, but taking it slow because they both carried damage that needed care. They held hands but didn't rush into anything physical. They talked about their fears and hopes. They let Sophie set the pace, letting her get comfortable with Lena's presence before making it official or permanent. 3 months after that Thursday morning, Lena stood in Ethan's workshop watching him sand a dresser he'd built from scratch. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating sawdust that hung in the air like golden snow. "I've been thinking," Ethan said without looking up from his work, "about what Rick said, about how showing up is half the battle." "Yeah?" "I think he's wrong. I think showing up is the whole battle. Everything else, the fear, the uncertainty, the risk, that's just noise. What matters is that you keep showing up for the people who matter." Lena moved closer, running her hand over the smooth wood of the dresser. "Is this going somewhere philosophical or somewhere personal?" Ethan finally looked at her, setting down his sandpaper with careful precision. "Personal. I'm showing up, Lena. Every morning at the diner, every Sunday with you and Sophie, every text message and phone call. I'm showing up because you matter, because this, whatever this is, matters. It matters to me too." "Good. Because I'm done pretending this is casual. I'm done protecting myself from possibility. I'm all in, if you want me to be." Lena felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were happy tears, the kind that came from being seen and chosen and valued. "I want you to be. I'm terrified and completely sure at the same time, which doesn't make sense but feels true. Nothing about this makes sense. We met because of humiliation and Bulgarian split squats. We built a relationship on coffee and dinosaur facts. None of it follows any logical pattern. Maybe the best things don't follow patterns. Maybe they just happen when two people decide to be brave together." Ethan crossed the workshop and pulled her into his arms, and Lena let herself lean into his solid warmth. This man who'd stood up for her when no one else would. Who'd shown her that kindness still existed, that courage was contagious, that showing up for each other was its own kind of revolution. That evening, Lena, Ethan, and Sophie sat on Ethan's back porch eating pizza and watching the stars emerge. Sophie was explaining her latest theory about parallel universes, while Lena and Ethan exchanged glances over her head, the kind of glances that said, "We're doing this. We're building something. We're choosing each other." "In a parallel universe," Sophie announced, "you two never met. Dad just kept eating breakfast alone, and Lena kept being sad at work, and nobody was brave enough to make things different." "That's a sad universe," Lena said quietly. "Very sad. But we're not in that universe. We're in this one, where Dad was brave, and you were brave. And now we're all friends, and it's much better." Sophie took a massive bite of pizza, satisfied with her logic. Ethan met Lena's eyes over Sophie's head. In his gaze, she saw everything they'd survived to get here, his loss and her humiliation, His courage and her resilience, all the ways they'd shown up for each other and for themselves. They saw the future stretching out with all its uncertainty and possibility, scary and beautiful in equal measure. The night air was warm with approaching summer. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world continued its normal operations while they sat together, this makeshift family built from crisis and choice. And Lena thought about that Thursday morning that felt both impossibly distant and immediately present. Thought about the moment her world had cracked open. The laughter, the shame, the silence that had fallen when one voice decided enough was enough. She thought about all the people who'd been changed by that moment. Marcus calling to apologize, Dorothy reaching out, Rick offering opportunities. The new customers who'd come seeking a place that valued dignity over cruelty. One voice in a silent room. One moment of courage. And here they were, months later, still feeling the ripples. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked softly. "Bulgarian split squats," Lena said, and when he looked confused, she laughed. "If I hadn't done them, if my legs hadn't been sore, if I hadn't said those words, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't be here." "Are you saying you're grateful for muscle soreness?" "I'm saying I'm grateful for all of it. The pain, the humiliation, the moment that broke me open enough to let people in. I'm grateful you were there. I'm grateful you spoke up. I'm grateful for this." She gestured at the three of them, at the porch and the stars, and the simple beauty of being together. Sophie, who'd been listening with the intense focus of someone cataloging important information, spoke up. "Mrs. Chen says that sometimes the worst things lead to the best things if you're brave enough to let them." "Mrs. Chen is very wise," Ethan said. "I know. That's why I listened to her." Sophie stood, brushing pizza crumbs off her lap. "I'm going to get dessert. Do you want ice cream or ice cream?" "Those are the same options," Ethan pointed out. "I know. I'm giving you the illusion of choice while maintaining complete control." "That's called strategy, Dad." She disappeared into the house, leaving Ethan and Lena alone in the growing darkness. "She's going to rule the world someday," Lena said. "I'm counting on it." Ethan took her hand, threading their fingers together. "Thank you for showing up, for taking the risk, for letting us be part of your life. Thank you for seeing me, for standing up, for reminding me that good people still exist." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, listening to Sophie rummage through the kitchen in search of ice cream. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The city breathed around them, full of other people's stories, other moments of crisis and courage. But here, on this porch, Lena and Ethan had found their own story. Not the one either of them had planned or expected, but the one they'd chosen when choosing would have been easier than fighting. And somewhere in the universe where people didn't speak up, where cruelty went unchallenged, where Lena and Ethan never connected, that version of reality existed too. But they weren't living there. They were here. In the universe where courage mattered, where showing up for each other was revolutionary, where a single moment in a diner had changed everything because one person decided silence wasn't acceptable. The door opened and Sophie emerged with 3 bowls of ice cream, distributed them with the precision of someone who'd carefully ensured hers was slightly larger, and settled between them with satisfied contentment. "This is nice," she announced. "Us being together. We should do this every Sunday forever." "Forever's a long time, Soph," Ethan said gently. "I know. That's why I said it. Some things are worth keeping forever." Lena looked at this child, this wise, ridiculous, wonderful child, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Looked at Ethan, who'd become her anchor and her adventure in equal measure. Looked at the life they were building together, imperfect and beautiful and theirs. "Yeah," she said softly. "Some things are worth keeping forever." And under the stars, eating ice cream on a Sunday evening, 3 people who'd found each other through pain and courage sat together in the quiet knowledge that they'd all been brave enough to let the worst moments lead to the best things. Lena's legs no longer hurt from Bulgarian split squats, but she'd never forget them. Would never forget the morning that had broken her and rebuilt her stronger. Would never forget the stranger in the window booth who'd decided her dignity was worth defending. The world kept turning. The diner kept serving breakfast. People kept making choices about whether to speak up or stay silent. to show cruelty or kindness, to see each other as fully human, or reduce each other to punchlines. But in the ripples spreading from one Thursday morning, things had changed. People had changed. And in the center of those ripples, Lena Brooks sat between Ethan Walker and his daughter Sophie, eating ice cream and watching stars, living proof that sometimes the right voice at the right moment can transform everything. The night grew deeper. The ice cream was finished. Sophie eventually fell asleep against Ethan's shoulder, her theories about parallel universes giving way to dreams. And Lena thought about all the versions of herself that could have existed. The one who quit after Thursday's humiliation, the one who never forgave the people who'd laughed, the one who stayed invisible and small and safe. But she wasn't any of those versions. She was this one, the woman who'd survived her breaking moment and found strength in the cracks, the woman who'd learned that being seen was terrifying and necessary, the woman who'd discovered that showing up was its own kind of courage. "Ready to go inside?" Ethan asked softly, careful not to wake Sophie. "In a minute. I just want to stay here a little longer." So they sat under the stars, this family that had chosen each other, and let the quiet beauty of the moment settle over them like a benediction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, work, and responsibilities, and the 1,000 small difficulties that comprised a life. But tonight, they had this, each other. The knowledge that they'd all been brave when bravery was required. And that, Lena realized, was everything. She'd walked into Franklin Street Diner that Thursday morning expecting nothing more than another shift, another day, another step in the endless march of just surviving. She'd walked out changed, broken open, vulnerable in ways that had terrified her. But from that vulnerability had come connection. From that pain had come growth. From that moment of humiliation had come this, sitting on a porch with people she loved, building a life that mattered, learning that courage was just deciding that someone else's dignity was worth defending. One voice in a silent room had changed everything. And as the stars wheeled overhead and Sophie snored softly against her father's shoulder, Lena Brooks finally understood that sometimes the moments that break you are the same ones that make you whole.